It's the week ending Saturday, the 9th of February, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Donald Trump delivering his delayed State of the Union, EU countries lining up to recognise Juan Guaido as the Venezuelan president, and Donald Tusk reserving a special place in hell for no-deal Brexiteers. But we're here to bring you some of the stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news, not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team are Holden, Frith, Kari, Wilkins and Rebecca Gillie, #Dream Team. Starting the show this week, it's Rebecca. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is it time to broaden our understanding of criminal responsibility?
For the last 6 years, my colleagues and I have been doing research that has completely changed the way we think about the criminal justice system and the people in it. And it may change the way you think about those things too. So I'll start with a shocking statistic. 50 to 80% of people in criminal justice have a traumatic brain injury. In the general public, in this room, for example, that number is less than 5%. And I'm not just talking about getting your bell rung. These are the kinds of injuries that require hospitalization.
That was Dr. Kim Gorgens delivering her TED Talk in September 2018. You can find more of those, of course, at TED.com. So, Rebecca, that is quite a stat. You also have a stat from this week's news to start this week's podcast with.
Yeah, and it's very relevant to the subject we just heard there. This is a new report from the Disabilities Trust in conjunction with Royal Holloway University. It's called Making the Link. They studied women inmates at HMP Drakes Hall in Staffordshire, and they found that of the, I think it was 173 women they followed, 65% of them had experienced a brain injury, and almost all of those were what would be classified as a traumatic brain injury.
Okay, traumatic brain injury. I mean, how do you get one of those?
Well, you get it from being hit on the head, as you may have suspected.
But that's more than just falling over, right?
Yeah, this is like a serious brain injury which can have an impact on your cognitive function, which is where it's going to become relevant to the prison debate. And even more shocking was the fact that around 2/3 of those women said that they had sustained those serious head injuries in a domestic violence incident. Most of the rest of them were involved in car accidents.
Wow. Okay, so the fact that, this clip of this doctor we were just hearing from at TED exists, from last year, and the fact that studies like this have been done before, presenting this as if it's a shocking thing now, but presumably this is a truth, is it, that's acknowledged within the prison system that is now being proven that the majority of inmates have traumatic head injuries?
Yeah, a study that was done, I think, in 2011 on an all-men's prison in the UK found that I think it was 60% of inmates there had a traumatic brain injury. Now, this isn't done with a medical screening. This is done through kind of like a self-assessment that the Disabilities Trust has put together. It's like 11 questions about medical history and past head injuries, which they use to assess whether someone suffered a brain injury.
Holden, what should the Justice Department do with this information?
There's sort of two areas in which it could have an impact. One is at the trial and sentencing, and then one is afterwards and how you best deal with people who do end up in prison. I think probably the second of those is the easier to deal with. Like if you know that you have a prison population in which a very large percentage have had these traumatic brain injuries, then you might have to handle them in a different way. You might have to seek different forms of treatment. I think the really hard part of this is what it means for the idea of criminal responsibility at a trial, and how you essentially establish what a person is responsible for and what might be a product of these other external factors.
Yeah, because that's it, isn't it, Kari? Like, if you ask the general public what motivated someone to do something like this, they'll say things like, oh, well, he must be mad. She must be wrong in the head. They'll use these casual phrases. But of course, in a court, you have to prove that someone either is clinically irresponsible for their actions, or if not, they're going to prison. This seems to say the kind of layman's approach of there must be something a bit wrong with them is just the case for most criminals.
Yeah, it's difficult. It raises so many questions of, it's very difficult to say someone is just innately evil. Most people, it's a result of their background, and it's very hard to draw the line of how much sympathy you apply in considering what this person has been through that's driven them to crime, but at the same time saying, well, the victims of this crime, they've also got to be avenged, or, to have justice, however you want to put it. As Rebecca was saying, a lot of these women's themselves, these inmates, had been the victims of domestic violence, and you could say that often they are victims of much more serious offences than the ones which they've committed. So, you do have to consider how that's affected why they're there.
What the study doesn't address really is cause and effect, because you could imagine a situation where there's actually a third factor that's led both to the criminal act and the violence. So, for example, thinking of drug addiction or homelessness, these are both things that could put women or men, for that matter, in situations where they're more vulnerable to violence and also more likely to commit a crime.
Exactly. It's whether those sort of, whether you want to say it's personality factors, background factors, whether that does make people more likely to offend because of the background, and also they're therefore more likely to experience violence, or, which cause and effect, as Holden says.
I mean, there's also the custodial sentence itself. Rebecca, only a third of these women had, I mean, it's still a high number, but only a third compared to the full amount had a head injury before their first incarceration. So that might suggest not domestic violence, but actually something happened to them in prison.
Yeah, well, the other thing is that many of the women that they studied had been in prison multiple times, which kind of plays into something else we know about women in prison, which is that women who receive short sentences tend to reoffend at a higher rate than men who receive the same length of sentence, even though on the whole men have a slightly higher rate of reoffending. And it's just one of these things that I think really plays into kind of more complicated understanding that we've had in recent years about the effect of prison on female inmates. I mean, obviously we know that rates of traumatic brain injury are similar among male and female inmates, but we've learned lots of things about the effects, particularly on women, of custodial sentences. For instance, it more frequently leads up to the breakup of families because women more often have dependent children, and a relatively high proportion of female inmates are there in conjunction with an offence committed by a partner that they've been involved in, not to absolve them of responsibility, but it's got these kind of complicated domestic factors, which I think, these are the reasons that last year the government announced that it was going to pivot away from a policy of custodial sentences for women convicted of non-violent offences.
And I think this also ties into what Holden's saying about what can be done, with this awareness of the effect of TBIs, as they're called, how we can therefore, adjust the system to take in this information. And I think also, as well as screening inmates before they enter prison and then giving them support once they are in there to reduce the likelihood of them reoffending, I think also possibly, and this is a very tricky one, but if there could be better links between A&E departments and schools, pinpointing young people who have behavioural issues, and TBI does have effects including decreased awareness of your own or others' emotional state, poor impulse control and social judgment. So there are signs to watch out for. And if they could then be sort of pinpointed and offered help to learn to control these impulses, that might be a preventative measure.
Do we know how much of that stuff actually happens in prisons as it is?
I believe there is some support offered to prisoners with TBI, but it does seem to be fairly limited.
Because the public basically have no interest in more resources being spent on prisoners' well-being, do they? That's sort of at the crux of any kind of reform like this.
It's not just about well-being, is it? It's about reducing the risk of reoffending, so it's in everyone's interest.
But in a balance of other things that are going on. So, I mean, yes, they may have a TBI. They may also have been members of a gang. They may also be addicted to drugs. They may also have previously offended and done something completely unrelated to the crime they're in for. There are so many things to take on board. There's the day-to-day thing of, are they a danger to their fellow prisoners or themselves? It's a lot for the prison system to deal with.
It is, and it's not a popular cause either. Part of what makes this really difficult is that it's also just a really depressing story, and that, the more you look into it, the more it feels...
Rebecca, thanks for starting the show.
Well, I know. This is the thing, is that, there are all these practical measures that we could take to improve the outcomes for people with TBIs, but fundamentally, to me, it raises kind of as Holden was saying, a kind of slightly depressing philosophical aspect, which is that some people really do have the deck stacked against them. We can pour resources into helping them, that might reduce rates of reoffending. But fundamentally, there are people who are, through no fault of their own, kind of cursed with a condition which can lead to things like poor impulse control and outbursts of aggression, which we need to, as a society, we need to punish, we need to, lock you away if you're a danger to other people. But there are these people walking around out there who really, through no fault of their own, are more likely to commit offences that can land them in prison.
And I think that has been, stepping back a bit, that has been one of the long-term trends of the last century or so, has been the kind of erosion of a sense of character as destiny and sort of personal responsibility, and the fact that you can hold an individual in a dock solely responsible for their actions. And that has left us in this really difficult position where we know a lot more about genetics, we know about social conditioning. We talked about the effect of lead in petrol, even the effect of bacteria in people's gut on what they do. And yet, for the justice system to work and really for society to have a kind of sense of meaning and restitution, we do still have to hold individuals responsible for what they do, even if there will be some extreme cases where that may be deeply unfair because the person in question had really no alternative but to do what they ended up doing.
OK, Kari, you're up next after this. Kari, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
I think this is the week we ask, should tasers be in the firing line?
You're under arrest. Get on the ground.
Tasers are often seen by police as non-lethal weapons.
Taser, taser, taser!
But amid a steady stream of deaths following taser shocks, some U.S. communities are rethinking their policies on how and when police should use the weapons. A Reuters investigation found that at least 49 people died in 2018 after being tasered by police, the third straight year with no significant decline. In all, Reuters has documented at least 1,081 cases in which people have died after taser shocks, almost all since the early 2000s when the weapons began coming into widespread use.
That was Reuters' special report from earlier this week entitled, "As Death Toll Keeps Rising, US Communities Start Rethinking Taser Use." And that is what a clickbait title sounds like when you read it out. Kari, law and order, very much the theme this week, it seems. And you have another remarkable statistic for us.
So Reuters reviewed police records and court documents dating back to when tasers became widespread in the early 2000s and found that almost 1,100 deaths in the US had followed the use of tasers by police. And as this clip said, they were touted when they were first released as a sort of a near-perfect, non-lethal weapon. And yet during the past 3 years, there have been an average of about 50 deaths a year. So clearly, it's not all that it was hoped it would be. OK,
so the manufacturers of taser might be looking to their PR consultants to put a spin on this. But compared to shooting someone with a gun, I mean, that's a small number of people that have died in the whole of the USA, isn't it? I mean, from that point of view, tasers are a success story. If these are cases where people would have been shot otherwise.
Well, they are, but I think critics would argue that police would be far less likely to draw a gun on someone than they would a taser because you know, that tasers can escalate the situation because it's seen as, exactly as you say, as being non-lethal, that they're being drawn in situations where arguably it doesn't merit it. And also I think there's a fear that police aren't being properly trained in how to use it. The manufacturers of tasers say that most deaths are the result of drug use, underlying physiological conditions such as heart problems and other force used by the police.
But so what? I mean, the drug use thing is a weird one, isn't it? Because, in some cases, taking Class A drugs is illegal, but in a lot of cases, the possession of it and the taking of it isn't. It's the selling of it that is. And if you're being apprehended because you're having an argument with someone in the street, whether or not you've been taking a drug that day shouldn't be the reason you die.
No, but I think they're drawing attention to the fact that it's very difficult to give a definitive cause of death in a lot of these cases, which is really muddying the water. A taser may have been a contributing fact, but if that person was already high and their physiological state was already disrupted by drugs, it's very hard to say. And often police will have applied other force during the arrest. It's very hard to say what the actual finite or, the key cause of the death was. OK, let's put the police force to one side because obviously that is relevant, but that's something on a case-by-case basis and then there's internal procedures and everything else. But the basic principle, Rebecca, that you've got something that's supposedly non-lethal and the perfect crime-fighting mechanic is a device that can kill people if they have an underlying heart condition and or have taken drugs that day. Is that something that ever should have been rolled out to police forces around the world?
Well, I think the manufacturers of the taser devices say that they come with clear advice about who you should and shouldn't be using them on, such as vulnerable populations. But vulnerable populations are obviously the most likely to be targeted by police. But
and
some
people
of that's
don't walk around with their heart rate on their sleeve.
Well, exactly. And some of that is just a factor of, the reality of policing is that the people you're going to interact with are often from vulnerable populations. The mentally ill, the elderly. There's been lots of cases of elderly people dying after having taser used on them, sometimes when they've got dementia or dementia-like conditions. As Kari was saying earlier, I don't think that police would necessarily be drawing guns in those situations, but a taser seems like, if you like, a kind of simpler alternative to other methods of de-escalation.
Yeah, I think it's all about being, well, not all about, but I think it's certainly a lot of it is that are these tasers being used correctly? I mean, these weapons can fire up to 50,000 volts. I mean, it's usually, in most cases, it's less, but 50,000 volts is a considerable amount, and it creates obviously a considerable amount of pain. And this has been in the headlines in the US recently because a man called Chinedu Okobi, who was an unarmed black man with a history of mental illness, he died after being tasered 3 or 4 times, at least, by Californian police in October. His sister's a Facebook executive and is saying that the police have lied about this and that they clearly used excessive force. I believe there's video footage that's emerged. So I think a lot of it is just in terms of, is it being applied properly? I mean, what's terrifying is that no government agency tracks how often tasers are used or how often it proves to be fatal. There's no constant standard used by coroners and medical examiners in assessing a taser's role in a death.
And in the UK, the majority of police officers are unarmed, which actually some of our international listeners might be surprised by. Holden, our resident historian, can you talk us through how we've got to the position we are now vis-a-vis tasers?
Yeah, and at the moment, tasers are also classified essentially the same as firearms in the UK. So you have to be a firearm authorised officer in order to carry a taser. So they're not actually widely used. Their use has been stepped up slightly in London, Manchester, and a few other big cities after the Paris attacks and subsequent terrorist attacks here. But their use is still very heavily restricted, and actually the number of deaths as a result are significantly lower here than in the US. Even so, there have been 18 deaths following police tasering since 2004. That compares with 27 people shot dead by police marksmen over the same period.
But a lot more tasers having been fired.
They've been fired still relatively infrequently, but drawn much more often. So they've been drawn about 17,000 times over the course of the past year, fired in about 2,000 of those cases.
So maybe the more relevant statistic then is to look at fatal deaths caused by the police using other things. I mean, unfortunately, the police kill people with batons, don't they? The police kill people with handcuffs by restraining them badly. I mean, is it a question of bad policing, bad use of the weapons, not the weapon itself?
Arguably. I mean, yeah, supporters of tasers point out that at least tasers have, unless, you do have underlying problems, the effects are temporary, whereas pepper spray, for example, the effects last for hours. Batons, obviously, you get broken bones, that sort of thing. So it is a more immediate, more effective, arguably, but less permanent effects.
And the concerns around tasers go beyond the actual fact of deaths relating to taser use. Well, we were just talking about the use of tasers in the UK police. There was a really interesting study published in December. It was the result of a study where a taser officer in the City of London Police was followed on 400 shifts, and across those 400 shifts, they only fired their taser twice. But on those shifts, there was a 50% greater chance that police used force. And that's without using... Yeah, but the taser was only drawn twice, so it was other kinds of force. So there was a higher chance that force would be used when there was a taser present,
but then, as Holden just explained, only the police officers that deal with those sorts of crimes, looking for terrorists, etc., are the people who are carrying tasers in this country anyway.
That's the thing.
This was also quite a small study, but there have been other broader studies of the effect of carrying weapons, whether it's tasers or guns, specifically comparing Swedish and Norwegian police. Swedish police are routinely armed, Norwegian police aren't. And it did find that police carrying weapons are more likely to be the victims of assaults themselves, as well as more likely to use force themselves.
That was in the City of London study as well.
The theory is it's known as the weapons effect, and it's the idea that although a lot of people react to weapons as a deterrent and as something to move away from...
Let me just be clear, if the police are listening, if ever they're drawn on me, that is how I would react. I have no intention to do you harm, officer.
But for some people, they are seen as a provocation, and they're more likely to generate an aggressive response. I wondered as well if police are more likely to put themselves in dangerous situations if they do have a weapon.
Or to be sent into dangerous situations if they have a weapon or with a weapon.
Certainly, but even if you're talking about kind of routine arming, whether that's actually likely to lead officers who perhaps had less training into more dangerous situations because they can feel they can get themselves out.
Or you might think, I don't need backup on this. Yeah. I'm going to go in by myself, but that requires you drawing the taser.
Yeah, or possibly just to be more aggressive in their in their dealings with people more generally, and that's more likely to generate an aggressive result.
You are parked on a double yellow. Back away from the car.
Amnesty International UK have been calling for the deployment of tasers to police to be restricted and to be very tightly monitored and controlled. And they point out that training for taser use by UK police at the moment typically takes an average of just 3 days, which is not much really when you're considering the effects that these things can have. So yeah, they're saying that, arguments aside about whether it's repressive, whether it's humiliating, whether it's a form of torture, which some people do argue, that it should just at least that there should be that it should be more tightly monitored. Police have only been required to keep data on the usage since April 2017, which is fairly gobsmacking when you consider that these have been in,
people have died in the UK
exactly
for years before that.
It was in 2008 that Home Office announced that all frontline officers could be armed with tasers. So that was a big gap in between there being any sort of official accountability.
It does seem to me to all point back to my question, which is it about the quality of the policing? The situations that you flagged up in the US, unarmed black man dying at the hands of the police. This is not the first instance of that. It sort of doesn't matter what the weapon is, does it? I mean, the problems that are in the police seem to be exacerbated regardless of whichever weapon they're using when they kill someone. What is the reaction to this going to be in the US?
Well, I think the difference is that the focus always needs to be on de-escalation. And from a UK perspective, using a taser is a massive escalation to normal policing techniques. I think in the US, it's going to be harder to make that claim because using a taser seems like a massive de-escalation from using a firearm. And I don't think the majority of people in the US are going to see this as a massive price to pay for maybe a lower use of firearms in the police.
OK, one last story to come after this. And so, finally this week, it is time for the section of the show I like to call Holden Makes My Brain Hurt. Holden, what do you think this week will be remembered for?
Donald Tusk isn't the only Pole who's been on manoeuvres.
Just like there are different definitions for what a year is, there are different North Poles. For example, compasses don't point to the geographic or spinning top North Pole. They point to the magnetic North Pole, which is incidentally a magnetic South Pole since opposites attract. The magnetic North, actually South Pole, and South, actually North Pole, are an electromagnet caused by swirling convection currents in the Earth's liquid iron outer core. These currents are heavily influenced by the rotation of the Earth, so the magnetic field they generate roughly aligns with the Earth's axis of rotation, but not precisely and not unchangingly.
Essays due in on Monday, everybody. That was Nima Darood on the YouTube channel 1 Minute Physics. I clearly need more than 1 minute to understand this because I don't know what's going on. Holden, what's going on?
What happened this week is the US government shutdown ended, and that meant we got access to a report from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA.
I bet Donald Trump can't even say that.
I can barely say it myself. And what it revealed is that the magnetic North Pole is now moving more quickly than it has done since records began.
OK. And for those of us who didn't know that the magnetic North Pole moved at all, that is a thing, is it?
It is, and this is separate from the geographic or true North Pole, which if you imagine a globe is where the pin would be sticking out and where all of the lines of longitude meet.
Yeah.
But that's not what a compass points to. The compass points to this separate point called the magnetic North Pole.
And according to that video, it's actually in the south.
That's a bit confusing. I think
it's massively confusing.
That video didn't really help. But it is essentially because opposites attract when it comes to magnets. So in order for the northern point of the compass to point towards the North Pole, that has to mean that the south of the Earth's magnetic field is at that point.
Right, so I'm right. The magnetic North Pole is in the south, and it moves, and it's different to the geographic North Pole. This is just not even getting to the news story yet.
That is correct.
Right.
But we call
Who's we in this scenario?
Anyone who cares.
And do you care? Are you someone who cares about the magnetic North Pole? Why is this your story of the week?
I do now. It actually does matter. It has real-world consequences for everyone.
But hold on.
Yeah.
The story is that it's moved. But it always moves. It's just moved a bit more than it usually moves.
It's moving a lot more quickly. And actually, the announcement this week was not scheduled to happen for another year. So there's, as well as the NOAA, the British Geographic Survey is involved in 5 yearly revisions of the Earth's magnetic model. And this is used by Google and Apple for their mapping software. It's also used by military in terms of planning.
But how? To tell you when you're heading north?
Yeah, and then to essentially to draw the map of the world around that northern point.
I see.
You know, we kind of have to know which way is up.
Okay, good. Let's escalate this so that we care. Kari, what else should we care about regarding this movable magnetic North Pole? Why does this affect us?
It's vital, actually, because it's vital for military undersea and aircraft navigation, for commercial airlines, for search and rescue operations, for surveying and mapping, satellite and antenna tracking, for smartphone and consumer electronic firms when they're putting together accurate models for up-to-date maps and compass apps. So it affects everything and everyone.
If it moves anyway, then they've built into their software that it moves anyway. So what's the problem?
It's moving much faster because basically, as Holden was saying, it's been the model on which it's based is updated every 5 years. And this first measurement of the magnetic pole was taken in 1831. So we've been aware of it since then. And since then, it's moved about 1,400 miles towards Siberia, which sounds like a lot. But up until about 2000, it was moving at a rate of 9 miles a year. Now it's moving at 34 miles a year. So obviously, we're going to need to keep updating it much more quickly.
Why is it moving? Rebecca, do you know?
Oh, God, no, my palms are just pouring with sweat. I'm having this ongoing GCSE science nightmare.
Okay, is there a climate change type, scary, human-based reason as to why it's moving? Have you been able to deduce?
Isn't it to
Holden's
do with...
got his hand up literally like we're in class. You're the teacher. Go on, yeah.
In this case, we're actually off the hook. There isn't a climate change link to the movement of the magnetic North Pole. A momentary tangent, there is a climate change reason for a very slight movement in the geographic North Pole. Because that, although scientists generally describe it as fixed, it can move by a few centimetres over the course of a century.
Right.
And the melting of ice and the movement of the continents as a result just changes the balance of the Earth slightly. So that does have...
I only just got my head around the fact about compasses not actually pointing to the geographical North Pole, and now you're telling me that the geographical North Pole
There's
is
a third
moving.
north as well, which we can completely ignore.
So wait, which one does Father Christmas live at?
There is some debate about that, but given that he moves so much on December the 24th, I'm assuming he wants to stay as fixed as possible for the rest of the year.
He's got an answer for everything this
So
time.
I would say geographic north is where Santa lives.
But isn't the magnetic pole shifting because of molten metal in the Earth's core?
So the magnetic field is generated by the liquid iron near the core of the Earth, and because it is liquid, as the Earth spins and also orbits around the Sun, there's just sort of movements in that molten mass.
There you go, Rebecca, that's the reason. That's the reason it's important. Movements in the molten mass. There you go.
If Holden's still taking questions, I've got one, which is, how much would the magnetic North Pole have to move before, when we looked at a compass, it was no longer pointing what we consider north?
This has happened, apparently.
What?
Yeah, and actually, so the reason this report came out now rather than next year is because we were approaching the limits of acceptable deviation from true north. This matters more the closer you get to the North Pole.
So this actually could affect shipping containers going off
and
course and things like that.
Aircraft as well.
Okay.
The effect gets greater as you get close to the North Pole. A lot of transatlantic routes from Europe to North America do get relatively close to the North Pole. If you're going from Tokyo to New York, depending on the winds, you could end up going directly over the North Pole. And your aircraft could go in between the geographic and magnetic North Poles, at which point
surely you're in an episode of The Twilight Zone.
The onboard compass would be pointing in directly the opposite direction from all of the other instruments you have on board. So these sort of things do have a real world impact.
Is there anything we can do about it?
There's nothing you can do about it. I'm fairly confident, Rebecca.
You're right.
Your limitations have been reached in this discussion. There might be something Holden can help with.
But just to talk about the sort of effects on us in the UK. In London, the discrepancy between true north and magnetic north is only a third of a degree. In Aberdeen, it's approaching 2 degrees. So that is something that you could notice with, just with a handheld compass. By the time you get to Reykjavik, it's 13 degrees. So clearly you could get quite lost if you were relying just on a compass in Reykjavik.
But isn't the magnetic pole, because it's been in the Canadian Arctic, hasn't it, and now it's moving towards Siberia?
It crossed the international date line last year,
wow.
moved from the western to the eastern hemisphere.
But
I was waiting for the pub fact to emerge from this, and that's the one. Thank you.
But
anyone listening just thinking, what's the thing I can tell my friends that I've learned? There we go.
But isn't it moving closer to true north over the past few years?
It's now moved away. It's starting to move away again.
Okay.
But yes, it has. For the last 150 years, most of that time, it has been moving closer to true north.
So we've been right for a while.
No, because what matters is
don't try and hold positive.
What matters is how it changes and how you account for that change in navigation systems. And the fact that we're relying more and more on these electronic mapping systems, where we don't really see all the calculations that are taking place, we just have to take their word for it, means that these sorts of calculations do matter a great deal.
Well, we've all been thoroughly briefed. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Holden, Frith, Rebecca Gillie and Kari Wilkins. Now remember, you can download our entire back catalogue poll to poll when you subscribe. Just search for The Week Unwrapped on your podcast app of choice, which thankfully does not rely on pointing north. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week, fly safe over Reykjavik.